My name is Cassidy. I'm 30 years old, and just last week my mother called me in tears for the very first time in my life. She told me she needed someone to take care of her. Before she could even finish asking, I already knew the 4 words I was going to say. 2 years earlier, I had been the one crying after hearing I had stage 3 cancer at just 28 years old. My mother answered me with a single sentence I have never forgotten. During 6 months of chemotherapy and 36 medical appointments, not once did anyone in my family come to see me. They were too busy planning my younger sister's wedding. But there was one thing none of them ever realized. While I was losing my hair and fighting for my life, my mother had quietly signed paperwork that placed everything in my sister's name. Welcome back to Diana True Stories, where we tell the quiet stories of people who finally stop apologizing for existing. If you've ever been the family member expected to sacrifice everything, this story is for you. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, and don't forget to subscribe. Now let me take you back 2 years, to an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and a phone call that changed everything. From the outside, my life looked stable. I worked as a paralegal at a small elder law firm in Pittsburgh, spending my days preparing Medicaid applications and reviewing deeds for clients. I liked the work because it followed rules. Numbers balanced, paperwork made sense, and the same laws applied to everyone. My family had never worked that way. I owned a small 1-bedroom condo, a coffee maker I treated like it was priceless, and a habit of always being the one who handled everything. I scheduled my mother's eye appointments. Every April, I filed my sister's taxes without charging her a dime. Whenever something went wrong in the family, my phone rang. I never expected theirs to ring for me. The few close friends I had called me dependable, which was really just a polite way of saying I never knew how to refuse anyone. I convinced myself that was one of my strengths. I was always the person who read every line of the fine print. I understood that giving a house to one child could quietly ruin a parent's chances of qualifying for future care. Clients appreciated my attention to detail, while their relatives often stood around confused. Never once did I imagine I would someday search public county records and discover my own mother's name there. That afternoon, I was sitting in the back office sorting through nursing home invoices for a client when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered because I'd spent my entire life making sure nothing important went unattended. A nurse spoke my name and said my doctor wanted me to come into the office first thing the following morning. Nobody schedules an in-person appointment for good news. Long after the call ended, I remained at my desk staring at those invoices. Before I tell you what happened next, you should understand my family. My father died when I was 12 years old. After that, my mother, Diane, managed our home like someone protecting the last lifeboat on Earth. There was never extra money, only just enough, and somehow that just enough always seemed to go to my younger sister. Vanessa was 4 years younger than me. She was the emotional one, the daughter who cried easily and was always comforted because of it. When Vanessa wanted to attend college, my mother paid the tuition. When I wanted to go, I was told student loans would build character. By 28, I had almost finished paying every dollar back. Vanessa had her degree, an engaged fiancé, and a wedding budget that seemed to grow larger every month. None of this was hidden. Every Sunday, while standing beside the same old blue Pyrex casserole dish she'd owned since I was a child, my mother would repeat the same sentence. This house stays in the family. The real family. You understand? I understood perfectly. The real family included husbands and grandchildren. I was simply the backup plan. The unmarried daughter who always had time because she hadn't filled her life with the right people. My mother believed that was simply how life worked. She had watched her own unmarried aunt devote her entire life to caring for elderly relatives, and she assumed history would repeat itself. The married daughter inherited the home. The single daughter inherited responsibility. I had heard that philosophy so many times it barely affected me anymore. What I didn't know that Tuesday evening was how quickly those expectations would collide, and how soon my mother would forget which daughter she would truly need. The next morning, my doctor didn't waste time softening the news. It's stage 3 Hodgkin lymphoma, she said. It's treatable, but we can't delay treatment. Chemotherapy starts in 2 weeks. I sat there quietly and did what I always did whenever life became overwhelming. I got practical, asked about the treatment schedule. I asked how many chemotherapy cycles I would need. I asked exactly how much my insurance would cover and what my out-of-pocket expenses would be because I had watched enough families fall apart over medical bills to know the biggest problems usually appeared after insurance stopped paying. She wrote down the estimates. I typed every number into my phone as calmly as if I were preparing paperwork for a client instead of planning my own cancer treatment. I still didn't cry. In my family, there had never really been room for my feelings. There was always someone else whose problems mattered more. When I left the office, I walked into the parking garage, found my car on the 3rd level, climbed inside, and placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there. I counted the concrete support pillars. I tried to figure out how someone was supposed to survive something like this completely alone. Then I did what every part of me, even the part that should have known better, wanted to do. I opened my contacts and found the one labeled Mom. My thumb hovered over the call button. I reminded myself that she was still my mother. Surely cancer was one situation where she wouldn't leave me on my own. I wasn't being naive. I simply wanted, for once, to be wrong about her. I pressed the call button. She answered after 2 rings. She sounded distracted, laughing at something happening in the background, and immediately asked what I needed because whenever I called, there was always a reason. I took a breath and said it as simply as I could. Mom, I have stage 3 cancer. I start chemotherapy in 2 weeks. I'm scared, and I don't want to go through this alone. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. My sister's voice echoed in the background, talking excitedly about ribbon colors for the wedding. My mother let out the same weary sigh she always used whenever I became an inconvenience. Then she said the words that have stayed with me ever since, in the same flat, emotionless tone. We can't deal with this right now. She reminded me that my sister's wedding was only 4 months away. I waited for her to say something else. I waited for, but of course we'll be there for you. Or maybe, send me your treatment schedule. Even a simple, I'm so sorry. None of that came. Instead, she listed everything that still had to be done before the wedding. The venue, the dress, Vanessa's nerves. Then she said something I had heard all my life. You've always been the strong one. You'll figure it out. You don't need us hovering. I heard her cover the phone and tell Vanessa she'd be right there. Then almost gently, she added the sentence that broke something inside me. Try not to worry your sister with this. She's already under so much stress. I answered, okay. Looking back, that's the part that hurts the most. I said okay in my normal voice, as though she'd simply asked me to pick up napkins on my way home. We ended the call. I sat alone inside my car in the dim parking garage and finally understood something I should have realized years earlier. There had never been a moment when my family would choose me. There was only a calendar, and my life had simply happened to fall at the wrong time. After that day, I didn't call my mother again for a very long time. Instead, I started watching from a distance, the way you watch storm clouds after learning not to trust the forecast. I knew that someday, everything would come back around. I just didn't know when. A few days later, I tried reaching out in another direction. I texted Vanessa. My message was careful, almost timid, like I was asking permission to need someone. I told her about the cancer. Then I asked if she could come with me to my first chemotherapy appointment so I wouldn't have to walk in alone. For almost an hour, I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear. When she finally replied, most of the message was about her upcoming dress fitting. At the very end, she wrote the sentence that stayed with me for the next 2 years. You don't even have a family of your own, Cass. You have time for this stuff. I don't. I read it 4 different times, convinced I had misunderstood. I hadn't. To my sister, the fact that I was single and didn't have children wasn't simply part of my life. It was something the family believed they could use whenever it benefited them. My empty schedule belonged to everyone else. Her busy schedule was untouchable. I called my mother one last time, hoping she would at least be embarrassed by what Vanessa had written. Instead, she defended her immediately, speaking patiently, as though explaining something obvious to someone who simply wasn't keeping up. "It's not like you have a husband waiting for you at home," she said. "Vanessa needs support right now." The way she said the word support, you would have thought Vanessa was the one preparing to sit through chemotherapy instead of me. I quietly placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there without moving. Something inside me became very quiet that afternoon. Not shattered. Not angry. Just quiet. Like a house after the last guest has finally gone home. From that day forward, I stopped asking my family for anything. If I needed help, I decided I would ask the universe before I ever asked my mother or my sister again. As strange as it sounds, the universe answered. Her name was Renee. She was a retired schoolteacher. 2 weeks later, I drove myself to my very first chemotherapy infusion. The treatment center was on the 4th floor of the hospital. The room held a long row of reclining chairs arranged in a gentle semicircle, each one standing beside and 4-pole like a silent companion. I checked in, rolled up my sleeve, and watched the nurse connect the first bag of medication. She must have noticed that I was completely alone because, a few minutes later, she returned carrying a folded blanket. Without making a big deal out of it, she spread it across my lap. It was an ordinary teal hospital fleece blanket, faded from countless washes and softened by years of use. It wasn't mine. There was nothing special about it. But that small act of kindness was the only thing that touched me with genuine care that entire day. I held onto that blanket as though it mattered, because in that moment it did. I had brought my laptop with me because work was the one thing that still felt normal. During the first hour of chemotherapy, I answered client emails and finished a benefits application while medicine slowly dripped into my veins. Around me, nearly every chair was occupied by 2 people. One husband worked through a crossword puzzle aloud with his wife. A grown son read sports scores to his mother. A young couple shared a pair of earbuds, listening together. I counted 19 treatment chairs. 18 of the patients had someone sitting beside them. Then there was me, just me, and a borrowed teal blanket that somehow kept me grounded enough to stay present. When the treatment finished, the nurse asked if someone was coming to pick me up. I smiled and told her I was fine to drive. It was a lie. I drove home anyway with both hands trembling on the steering wheel and the radio turned off. At my next appointment, I carefully folded the blanket and brought it back because I felt guilty for keeping something that didn't belong to me. The nurse smiled. Then she quietly told me to keep it. I still have that blanket today. Meanwhile, Sunday dinners continued without me. They had always been the center of my mother's world. Now, every gathering revolved entirely around Vanessa's wedding. Every Monday morning, I saw reminders in the family group chat. Photos of the old blue Pyrex casserole steaming on the counter. Every Monday morning, another picture would appear in the family group chat. It was always the same blue Pyrex casserole sitting on the counter with a cheerful caption like, "Wish you were here, sweetie." Yet those messages never came with an actual invitation, an offer to pick me up, or even a promise to save me a plate. That casserole had fed me throughout my childhood, but now it only reminded me that my place at the table had quietly disappeared. Before long, I stopped opening the group chat on Monday mornings. At the same time, the medical bills began arriving in plain white envelopes, each carrying its own quiet kind of violence. Even after insurance paid its share, I still owed just under $38,000. I sold the few stocks I owned, canceled every subscription I could live without, survived on whatever was already in my pantry, and placed the remaining balance on a payment plan that would stay with me for years. By the 3rd month, money became painfully tight. For the first time, I broke the promise I'd made to myself and called my mother. Asked if she could lend me just a few $1,000s until an insurance reimbursement arrived. She answered almost immediately. "We just paid the deposit for Vanessa's wedding venue," she said. "There isn't anything extra right now. You'll manage. You always do." I didn't argue. By then, arguing felt like knocking on a door I already knew would never open. Still, I noticed the order of things because noticing details was what I did best. A wedding deposit came before my cancer treatment. A celebration mattered more than my survival, and not by a small margin. I tucked that fact away in my memory the same way I filed important documents, quietly, carefully dated, waiting to see if it would ever matter. It mattered far more than I expected. The final blow came in October, just 1 week before Vanessa's wedding. By then, chemotherapy had taken almost all of my hair. I wore a soft cotton cap I'd ordered online and convinced myself I would still attend. I wouldn't draw attention to myself. I'd simply sit quietly in the back, because that's what a sister should do. Then my mother called. She used that calm, reasonable voice she always reserved for requests she knew were impossible to defend. She said it might be better if I stayed home. She explained that I looked sick, that wedding photographs would last forever, and that she didn't want anything distracting attention from Vanessa on her special day. She actually used the words "pull focus," as though I were an unwanted stain on a perfectly arranged tablecloth. I stood in my hallway staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked thin, pale, nearly bald beneath a cotton cap. A woman fighting for her life. And my own mother was asking me to protect the family from having to look at me. Once again, I answered the same way. Okay. Then I hung up. This time I didn't cry. That surprised me. I'd expected tears. Instead, something inside me simply cooled, becoming calm and steady, like a thermostat switching off. That was the day I stopped waiting for them. I stopped checking my phone, hoping someone would change their mind. I finally accepted that, in my family, my pain would always be scheduled around someone else's celebration. A person can only learn the same lessons so many times before deciding never to take that class again. Sitting alone in my quiet condo with that borrowed teal blanket folded across the couch, I had no idea the waiting wasn't actually over. It had simply changed direction. And soon, life would bring someone unexpected into mine. Her name was Renee Albright. She began receiving treatment in the chair beside mine that November. Renee was a retired high school English teacher who wore colorful silk scarves over her thinning hair and always carried a thermos she stubbornly refused to explain. She watched me spend an entire chemotherapy session answering work emails before finally leaning over and saying in the dry, matter-of-fact voice only teachers seem to master, "No one should answer emails while they're being poisoned. It sets a terrible precedent." For the first time in weeks, I laughed. After that, she somehow managed to schedule her treatments at the same time as mine. She never admitted she was doing it intentionally, but she always appeared in the chair beside me. She even started bringing an extra cup so we could share whatever was inside that mysterious thermos. It turned out to be incredibly strong ginger tea. Honestly, it settled my stomach better than anything the doctors prescribed. Renee had been widowed for 9 years. Her only son lived 3 time zones away and called every Sunday. Somewhere along the way, she'd decided loneliness wasn't something you endured. It was something you solved by showing up for the person sitting beside you. One afternoon, she casually asked who was driving me home. I gave my usual answer. "I'll be fine." She looked at me the same way every great teacher looks at a student who insists the missing homework doesn't matter. She saw right through me. "Family," she said while stirring her tea, "is simply the people who keep showing up. Everything else is paperwork." I almost laughed and told her paperwork happened to be my profession. Instead, I accepted the ride home. She became the first person to drive me home after chemotherapy. As I sat quietly in her passenger seat with a teal blanket folded across my lap, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief. Not because I was getting better, but because, for once, I wasn't the one carrying everything. At the time, I had no idea how much I would eventually need her. The wedding happened exactly as everyone had planned, without me. I saw it the same way I saw almost everything about my family by then, through photographs someone else uploaded before they remembered to make the album private. There was my mother in a lavender dress, wiping away happy tears. There was Vanessa, glowing beside her new husband, Grant, his hand resting proudly on her back. There they all were, the entire real family, standing together on a perfectly manicured lawn beneath a caption my mother proudly wrote, "The happiest day of our lives." I looked at the picture once. Then I closed the app. The next morning I went back to work. because work was still the one place where the numbers always made sense. That same week, in what I would later stop believing was a coincidence, Margaret Holloway placed a new case file on my desk. Margaret was the attorney I worked for, a woman in her 50s with a mind as sharp as a blade. The file belonged to a man in his 70s who had transferred ownership of his home to his son, believing it would protect the property. Now he needed nursing care he could no longer qualify for. Margaret explained exactly where everything had gone wrong. "People assume giving away the house keeps it safe," she said, tapping the deed with her pen. "Most of the time, it only destroys the Medicaid calculation." She walked me through the 5-year look-back period, the state's review of every property transfer made below fair market value, and the penalty formula that could leave someone ineligible for benefits for months. That day, I learned an important lesson. A house transferred too late doesn't protect the parent. It traps them. I memorized every calculation, every formula, every detail until I could practically work it out on the back of a napkin. Without realizing it, I stored that knowledge in the same part of my mind that never forgot important facts, never imagining I would someday use those numbers to understand my own mother. After work, I drove home, past the church where my sister had recently gotten married, and kept driving without slowing down. The hardest night came after my 4th round of chemotherapy. By then, the weight of everything had finally caught up with me. The nausea came in relentless waves. Every bone in my body ached until my own skin felt like a coat that no longer fit. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I called my mother, not because I believed she would help, because 2 in the morning strips away every layer you've built around yourself, leaving only your oldest instincts. Mine still reached for her. The phone rang until it went to voicemail. Her mailbox was full, filled with messages from caterers, travel agents, and people arranging Vanessa's honeymoon. I tried again. The same result. I ended up lying on my bathroom floor with a teal blanket wrapped around me. By then, it wasn't just a hospital blanket anymore. It had become mine. Sometimes the only thing that stays loyal through a terrible year earns that place. Finally, I sent Renee a text containing only 3 words. "I'm not okay." 40 minutes later, she let herself into my condo using the spare key I had given her without ever admitting why. She didn't ask questions. She sat beside me on the cold bathroom floor, held the wastebasket while I was sick, and quietly recited a poem under her breath until the worst passed. Sometime near sunrise, I fell asleep against her shoulder. The following morning, my mother finally returned my call. She sounded cheerful. She asked if everything was all right. She explained she'd been overwhelmed with honeymoon planning. I simply told her it was nothing. By then, I had learned that anything I entrusted to her would eventually be forgotten. After that night, I stopped calling people who only answered emergencies that didn't belong to me. The list of people I trusted at 2 in the morning had been reduced to exactly 1. And she wasn't related to me by blood. Looking back, that turned out to be the most important calculation of all. If you're listening to this and someone immediately came to mind, someone who only reaches out when they need something, you already understand exactly how I felt during that year. I'm not telling you to become bitter. I'm telling you to pay attention to who answers the phone at 2 in the morning. Those people are your real family, whether you share blood or not. Stay with me, because this is where the paperwork finally begins to tell its own story. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. A few weeks later, my mother called during one of her rare performances of concern. For nearly 10 minutes, she talked about Vanessa's new married life. Only near the end did she politely ask how my treatments were going, almost as though she were leaving a tip on the table before walking away. Normally, I would have let the conversation end there. But then she casually said something that lodged in my mind like a splinter. She told me not to worry about the house. The strange part was, I had never asked about the house. There was a brief silence while I tried to understand why she had mentioned it. Then she continued in that calm, reassuring tone she always used when she wanted to smooth over something important. "Everything's been taken care of," she said. "I've made sure the house stays where it belongs, with the family. You don't need to think about it." I asked what she meant by taken care of. Immediately, she became vague. Just like every client I'd ever met who had signed paperwork without fully understanding what they'd done. She quickly changed the subject to Vanessa's kitchen remodel. But I recognized that tone. I'd heard it across conference tables hundreds of times. Clients describing property transfers they barely understood and almost always regretted. Where it belongs. With the family, the real family. After we hung up, that uneasy feeling only grew stronger. In my profession, whenever someone says something has been handled, it usually means there's a document somewhere carrying consequences no one bothered to read. And when it comes to deciding who owns a house, there's only one document that matters. And only one place where that document is officially recorded after it's signed. I knew exactly where to find it. I searched those records for clients every single week. I had simply never considered typing my own mother's address into the search field. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe I should. For the next 3 days, I argued with myself. Looking up my mother's property records felt strangely personal. Almost like reading someone's private diary. Even though I knew better than anyone that a recorded deed is one of the most public documents a person can own. It's public by design. The entire property system depends on everyone being able to verify ownership, so no one can secretly transfer or sell real estate behind someone else's back. One evening, I explained all of this to Renee over the phone, mostly because I was trying to convince myself not to do it. She listened patiently until I finished. Then she said something so simple it cut straight through my hesitation. "Cassidy," she said, "it's public information. Reading public records isn't snooping. It's just knowing how to read." Her words stayed with me. For most of my life, I had treated my mother's decisions like the weather. Something mysterious. Something unavoidable. Something that simply happened to me. But a deed isn't weather. A deed is a fact. And every fact comes with a date. The date was there in black and white, officially recorded, stamped, and available for anyone with enough patience to search the address. The very next afternoon, during my lunch break, I opened the county recorder's website, the same one I used countless times every week for clients. But this time, instead of entering a stranger's address, I typed in the address of the house where I had grown up. My fingers weren't steady. That irritated me because I had searched hundreds of unfamiliar properties without feeling anything at all. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe my mother had refinanced. Maybe someone had corrected a spelling error. Maybe it was just another routine property filing. I refused to believe she had done the exact thing I spent my career warning families never to do. Then I pressed search. The loading icon spun for a few seconds. When the page refreshed, the newest document attached to my childhood home appeared on the screen. It had been recorded 8 months earlier, right in the middle of my chemotherapy treatments. It was a quitclaim deed. Grantor, Diane M. Atkinson. Grantee, Vanessa A. Atkinson. My sister. Using her maiden name. The document had been filed just 3 weeks before her wedding. Consideration, $1. I read the page once. Then again. Then 2 more times. Just like I had reread Vanessa's text months earlier, searching for the misunderstanding. There wasn't one. My mother had legally transferred the entire house, the same house she always insisted would remain with the family, to my sister for exactly $1. She had done it 8 months into my cancer treatment. She had done it during the same season. She told me there wasn't enough money to help pay my medical bills. She had done it while I lay on my bathroom floor wrapped in a borrowed blanket, praying for enough strength to make it through another day. I printed the document. Even now, I'm not completely sure why. Maybe I needed something tangible. Maybe I needed to hold the truth in my hands. The office printer slowly produced a copy of the recorded deed. I folded it once, placed it inside a manila folder, exactly the way I had done for hundreds of client files over the years. That was the moment my profession and my heartbreak collided. Because the instant I saw that $1 transfer, the trained part of my brain automatically started calculating. 8 months earlier. Well within Medicaid's 5-year look-back period. Which meant that if my mother ever needed nursing home care, giving that house to my sister for $1 wouldn't protect her assets at all. It would trap her. Exactly like the elderly man in Margaret Holloway's case. She could become ineligible for benefits for months, possibly longer. while someone desperately tried to undo the damage or pay privately. Standing beside the printer, holding that piece of paper, I realized two things at once. The first was painful. I had mattered so little that my own family had quietly rearranged everything without ever telling me. The second realization was colder. They hadn't simply abandoned me. They had moved every meaningful asset beyond my reach while I was busy fighting for my life. And someday, that decision would come due. I'd like to tell you I called my mother that very night and confronted her. I didn't. Instead, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the teal blanket over my knees and the folded deed in front of me. I thought about what confronting her would actually accomplish. There would be shouting. There would be tears. Mostly hers. Vanessa would gather the rest of the family and tell everyone I was jealous, bitter, and impossible. My mother would paint herself as the victim, a sick woman being attacked by her own daughter over a house. Nothing would change. The only thing I'd gain would be more proof, in their eyes, that I was the difficult daughter. So, I chose the harder option. I stayed silent. I labeled a folder with my mother's address, slipped the deed inside, and placed it in the same drawer where I kept all of my important papers. It wasn't hidden. That distinction mattered. A secret is something you conceal. This wasn't a secret. It was a public record that I had simply decided to read. Whether I confronted anyone or not, the county had already stamped it with the truth. That weekend, Renee came over. I handed her the document. She read every page carefully before folding it and giving it back. "For now," she said quietly, "knowing is enough. You don't have to act on it. You just don't have to keep pretending anymore." That was the greatest gift she could have given me. After that day, I stopped wondering whether my mother loved me, but simply struggled to show it. The deed answered that question permanently. No one transfers an entire house to one daughter for $1 while telling the other daughter there's nothing available to help with cancer treatments. After that, I returned my attention to the only project that still made sense. Getting well. Building a life my family would never be invited into. The document could stay where it was. Facts are patient. They don't disappear because you leave them in a drawer. Spring finally arrived, and with it came my last chemotherapy infusion. A few weeks later, my scan results came back. For the first time since my diagnosis, there was no evidence of disease. My doctor delivered the news carefully. Doctors rarely say the word cured. Instead, they say remission and let that quiet word carry the weight of hope. Renee had no interest in being quiet. She cheered right there in the examination room and convinced the nurse to hug me. For one afternoon, I allowed myself to believe I had truly survived. I had defeated the illness my own family couldn't be bothered to stand beside me through. Then, like always, I returned to work rebuilding my life. I refinanced my debt, combining the medical bills into payments I could realistically manage. I also began studying for the Certified Medicaid Planner credential. If I was going to dedicate my career to helping families navigate this complicated system, I wanted the qualifications that made people trust my advice. Soon afterward, I earned a small raise. Most of that extra income went straight toward paying down the debt I'd carried since my diagnosis. I paid the loan down little by little. During treatment, I learned to cook the handful of meals that didn't make my stomach turn, and even after chemo ended, I kept making those same dishes just to prove to myself that I could still take care of me. None of it was dramatic. That was the whole point. While my family imagined me, if they thought about me at all, as the poor single daughter drowning in medical bills, I was quietly, patiently learning how to stay afloat. I never told them any of it. There was no reason to. The less they knew about the life I was rebuilding, the more wrong their assumptions would be when those assumptions finally mattered. I didn't have a master plan. What I had was a clean scan, debt that was slowly shrinking, a professional certification on the horizon, a friend who always answered the phone at 2 in the morning, and a folded deed tucked inside a drawer. As it turns out, that isn't nothing. As it turns out, that's almost everything. 2 years slipped by the way they do once you stop measuring time and appointments. My hair grew back, darker than before, and eventually I stopped flinching every time I caught my reflection in the mirror. I earned my Certified Medicaid Planner credential and began taking clients of my own, families sitting across my desk during some of the hardest weeks of their lives. I discovered that I was good at giving them the calm they needed. Renee and I made Thursday dinner a standing tradition every single week. No exceptions. It was the kind of dependable presence I had spent my entire life giving to other people without ever receiving in return. For the first time, I learned what it felt like to be the person who got driven home instead of always being the one behind the wheel. With my family, I kept only the thinnest thread of contact: a birthday text to my mother, a thumbs up on a cousin's baby picture, nothing that required sitting around the same table. Every so often, my mother still posted a picture of the blue Pyrex dish in the family group chat, the Sunday roast steaming on the counter, and one Thursday, I realized I had scrolled right past it without feeling that familiar ache. The dish that once reminded me of the table I'd been quietly cut from had become nothing more than dinner in a house where I no longer needed a seat. That was the clearest sign I was finally free. Not because I had stopped loving them, but because their version of family no longer had the power to hurt me. I truly believed that chapter was over. I had built a quiet, steady life out of the wreckage they had left behind, and I expected the rest of it to remain that way: distant, manageable, survivable. Then, on an ordinary Thursday evening, while I was chopping onions for Renee's visit, my phone lit up on the kitchen counter with a name I hadn't seen in months.
Mom.
When I answered, she was crying. I almost let it ring. I stood there with the knife still in my hand, my eyes burning from the onions, watching the screen vibrate. But an old instinct, the one that had shaped my entire childhood, reached out before my better judgment could stop it. I answered. Something was wrong with her voice from the very first word. It sounded thin, frightened. The edges were slightly slurred. She told me she'd suffered a stroke 10 days earlier. For 10 days, I had been living my ordinary life just 2 suburbs away, and no one had bothered to tell me. Later, I pieced together the reason. Vanessa had assured the relatives that she had everything under control and asked them not to involve me until the family figured out what it actually needed, which was simply a polite way of saying until the family needed me. I'd muted the family group chat months before, so the few worried messages anyone posted drifted right past me unread. My mother's left side wasn't working properly. She couldn't climb the stairs. She couldn't dress herself. She couldn't stay alone for very long. She needed help. Daily help. Hands-on help. And she was going to need it for the foreseeable future. I leaned against my kitchen counter and listened, and I noticed something I would keep noticing for the rest of that conversation. She never asked how I was. She never asked whether my scans were still clear. She never asked if the cancer she'd been too busy for had stayed gone. It never seemed to occur to her that the last real conversation we'd had was while I was fighting for my life, a fight she couldn't make room for. In her mind, I had simply been sitting on a shelf for 2 years, available whenever she needed me. And now she was reaching for me again. "You were always the strong one, Cassidy," she said through her tears. "I need my strong girl now." I held the phone and felt an unexpected calm settle over me, the strange peace that comes when something arrives exactly when you've always known it would. Ever since the day I printed that deed, I had known this call was coming. The math had already told me. I just hadn't expected it to arrive wrapped in my mother's fear, asking for my time, my strength, and my future in the same flat voice she had once used to tell me she couldn't deal with my cancer. I told her I'd think about it. Then I called Renee. The family machine sprang into action the moment it sensed a solution. Vanessa called the very next morning, brisk and organized, sounding more like someone assigning chores than speaking to her sister. She and my mother had obviously already decided exactly what was going to happen. She wasn't calling to ask me. She was calling to tell me my role. "You work from home part of the week," she said. "You're single. You don't have kids. It just makes the most sense for you to move in with Mom." She presented it as simple logistics, as fairness, as the obvious arrangement any reasonable person would agree to. When I calmly asked why she couldn't do it herself, she already had every answer prepared. She had Grant. She had the baby. She had a life that couldn't simply be put on hold. And then she said those same words again, the exact same sentence. 2 years earlier, she had said those same words to me, as if she couldn't even hear them herself. as if they were a simple fact of life instead of a blade. You don't have a family of your own to worry about, Cass. I let the silence linger before I answered. Funny, I said. 2 years ago, I wasn't enough family to visit in the hospital. Now, I'm enough family to move into one. She had no response to that, so she did what she always did best. She made me the problem. An hour later, Aunt Carol called to reinforce the message. In my family, Aunt Carol was the enforcer, the one who showed up wrapped in righteousness, delivering guilt with the confidence of someone quoting scripture. A good daughter wouldn't even need to be asked, she told me. But there was one thing none of them mentioned. One thing they assumed I still didn't know. Not a single one of them brought up the house. They were organizing my mother's future as though they had endless options. They had no idea I had already read every one of them. I know some of you are probably talking back to your screen right now, telling me not to move in. Don't worry, but pay attention to what I noticed. Not once did anyone ask whether I was healthy. They only asked whether I was available. Those are two completely different questions. And the difference between them is this entire story. If your family has ever confused the two, you already know exactly what I mean. Stay with me, because there's a house, a deed, and one number they all forgot to check. The invitation arrived a few days later, and it was almost too perfect. Vanessa was hosting a housewarming party. After 2 years, she and Grant had finally finished renovating the place, and she wanted the entire family to come see it. And as she put it, sit down together and figure out Mom. I read the message twice. The house she was so proud to show off, the house she had spent 2 years renovating, was my childhood home. The same home my mother had quietly signed over to her for $1 while I was bald, buried in medical debt, and begging the darkness to help me survive. Now she wanted to gather the whole family inside that house so they could pressure me, the spare daughter, into giving up my life to care for the woman who had handed her the deed. They were going to do it the way my family always did, with an audience. Because it's much easier to corner one person when everyone else is watching. My mother would be there in her wheelchair, looking helpless. Aunt Carol would be there to preach about duty. The cousins would nod along. And I was expected to play the role they had already written for me. The dependable daughter. The one who says okay in her normal voice. And starts packing. I sat with the invitation for a long time. What settled inside me wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind that comes when a problem finally reveals its true shape. They thought they could use the house against me. They had no idea the house was about to speak for me instead. I replied with just 2 words. I'll come. Then I opened my laptop, pulled up the county recorder's website one more time to make sure nothing had changed, and called the one person who could explain exactly what that $1 deed had set into motion. The next morning, I laid everything out for Margaret, professional to professional, the same way I would have presented any client's case. Mother in her 60s. Recent stroke. Needs long-term care. Primary residence transferred to her other daughter through a quitclaim deed for $1. Recorded 20 months ago. Margaret didn't even reach for a calculator. She had seen this exact disaster countless times before. So, she said, the house is no longer in your mother's name, and the transfer happened well inside the 5-year look-back period. Together, we worked through the numbers on the whiteboard. The home was worth roughly $340,000. You take the value of the transferred asset and divide it by the state's penalty divisor, the average monthly cost of nursing home care used for Medicaid calculations, which that year was a little over $12,000. $340,000 divided by approximately $12,000 came out to around 28 months. 28 months, Margaret said as she capped the marker, during which Medicaid won't contribute a single dollar toward her nursing care because she voluntarily gave away the asset that should have paid for it. I asked what options remained. There are always a few. She could privately pay roughly $12,000 every month. But she couldn't. She had already given away the asset that represented most of her wealth. She could apply for an undue hardship waiver. Margaret told me those requests are denied more often than not. Then she explained the only option that really mattered. Your sister could transfer the house back. In many cases, returning the asset reverses the transfer and removes most of the Medicaid penalty, although it depends on the state, the timing, and how far the application process has already gone. It's rarely as simple as signing one piece of paper, but the principle stayed the same. The only person who could fix the math was the one holding the asset. I wasn't planning to threaten anyone with that information. I didn't need to. I was simply going to be the only person standing in that housewarming who actually understood what the deed meant. That night, I called Renee and told her everything. The invitation, the numbers, the 28-month penalty. She stayed quiet for a moment. Then she asked the only question that truly mattered. What do you actually want, Cassidy? Not what would win. What do you want? I thought about it honestly. I didn't want the house. I didn't want my mother to suffer, despite everything. That isn't how I'm built. And I don't think that's how most people are built. What I wanted was to stop being the family's emergency fund with a heartbeat. I wanted to say the truth out loud in front of the people who had spent 2 years pretending it wasn't true. Then I wanted to get back in my car and drive home to the life I had built for myself. You don't owe them your body, Renee said simply, the way she always spoke. You already gave them 2 years of silence on a bathroom floor. That's paid in full. I told her I wasn't going there to punish anyone. I was going there to stop volunteering to be punished. She liked that. She told me to wear something that made me feel like myself, to take my time, and to leave the second it stopped being useful. The next afternoon, before I drove over, I folded the teal blanket and set it on the passenger seat of my car. It had ridden with me to every infusion, sat on my lap through the worst nights, and become the one soft thing I'd kept from the hardest year of my life. I wasn't going to carry it into the party for show. I just wanted it there in the car, the way you keep a hand on something solid. I was bringing my whole self to that house, the survivor, the professional, and the daughter they'd written off. The blanket was simply the part of me I could hold. The house looked smaller than I remembered and richer than it had any right to. Vanessa had done well with someone else's gift. New shutters. A renovated kitchen I could see through the front window. The kind of upgrades you make when you're certain a place is yours forever. Cars lined the street. Cousins and neighbors. The whole audience my family liked to perform in front of. I parked, left the blanket on the seat, and walked up the path I'd walked 10,000 times as a kid. Inside, amid the warmth of bodies and the smell of food, sat the blue Pyrex casserole on the renovated kitchen island, steaming with my mother's pot roast. It had apparently been handed down with the house. The ritual inherited along with the deed. The real family's dish in the real family's kitchen. A few relatives greeted me with the kind of gentleness people reserve for the poor relation. A cousin asked if work was treating me okay. An aunt told me I looked tired in the tone that really meant, you look poor. They thought they knew exactly who I was. The single one. The broke one. The one who would say yes, because what else did she have going on? My mother sat in her wheelchair near the center of the living room, smaller than I'd ever seen her. Aunt Carol stood at her shoulder like a bailiff. Vanessa floated through it all as hostess, glowing in her own front room. They had the scene set exactly the way they wanted it. The wheelchair, the crowd, the beautiful daughter. Every single person in that house thought they knew what I was going to say. Not one of them had read the document I'd read. I took a glass of water, found a chair, and waited for them to begin. They didn't make me wait long. After the plates were cleared, Aunt Carol tapped her glass and got the room's attention. Of course, this was always going to be public. She began warmly, talking about family, hard times, and how when one of us falls, the rest of us carry them. Then she turned to me, and the warmth disappeared. We all know Dia needs care now, she said. And we all know who's in the best position to give it after everything your mother did for you, Cassidy. The room murmured its agreement. My mother picked up her cue and began to cry softly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she already had in hand. I need you, sweetheart, she said. You're the only one strong enough. The only one without a family pulling at her. Vanessa chimed in from the doorway. We figured you'd move in by the end of the month. It saves hiring someone, and it's not like you'd have to give up much. I sat still and let every word land. The way you let a wave pass over you instead of fighting it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tear up. I'd spent 2 years learning that the calmest person in a room is the one holding the actual facts. And for once, I was the calmest person in the room. They were performing need at me. The wheelchair, the tissue, the crowd, the inherited casserole steaming on the island. I waited until Aunt Carol asked me directly, in front of everyone, whether I'd do my duty. Then I set down my glass of water, reached into my bag, and took out a single folded sheet of paper. The room didn't know it yet, but the paperwork was about to start talking. I unfolded the deed and laid it flat on the table beside the blue Pyrex. Before anyone moves in with anyone, I said, we should all be looking at the same facts. This is a recorded deed. It's a public document. Anybody in this room could have pulled it. I just happened to read these for a living. It shows that 20 months ago, 3 weeks before the wedding, Mom signed this house, the house we're all standing in, over to Vanessa for $1 while I was in chemotherapy. The room went completely silent. Vanessa's face changed. I kept my voice level, the same way I do across my desk with clients. Here's what that means for Mom's care. When you give away your house within 5 years of needing nursing care, the state counts it. There's a look-back period and a penalty. This house was worth about $340,000. You divide that by the state's monthly penalty divisor, a little over $12,000, and you get roughly 28 months. For 28 months, Medicaid will not pay 1 cent toward Mom's nursing care because the money that was supposed to cover it is sitting in this kitchen. I let the silence breathe. Aunt Carol's mouth hung open. So somebody is going to be paying about $12,000 a month, I said. Or somebody is going to have to deed this house back to Mom to undo the gift and clear most of the penalty. And there's really only one person who can do that. The house isn't in my name. It isn't in Mom's anymore either. It's in the name of the person who threw this housewarming. Not the daughter you skipped at the hospital. The daughter you handed the house to. I slid the paper and inched toward Vanessa. I'm not telling you what the law forces you to do, I said. Nobody made you Mom's nurse by putting your name on a deed. I'm telling you who's holding the only asset that can fix this. That's not me being cruel. That's just where the house ended up. Then the room did what rooms do when the floor shifts beneath them. Vanessa was the first to raise her voice. You just want the house back, she said, her voice climbing. You've always. I've never been jealous, I replied calmly. This isn't about the house, Vanessa. I just want you to understand what you agreed to when you accepted it. Grant's face lost all color. He wasn't shouting, he was calculating. I could almost see the numbers running through his mind. $12,000 a month, stacked against the renovations they had poured their savings into. Then he turned to my mother instead of me. Diane, he asked quietly, his voice tight with disbelief. Did you know any of this when you transferred the house? That was the first crack in the image of the perfect family. My brother-in-law wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the woman who had handed them a gift that came with hidden consequences. Cornered, my mother fell back on the only strategy she had ever known. She cried harder. When that failed to move me, the tears turned into anger. How could you, she demanded. How could you humiliate me like this after everything I've done for you? For a brief moment, I saw what anyone would have seen, a frightened elderly woman in a wheelchair, terrified of what was coming. I let myself feel that compassion because I'm human. I only wanted to keep the house and the family, she whispered. For the grandchildren. Maybe she even believed that. But one thing stood out. She never apologized. Not once did she say she was sorry for leaving her daughter to battle cancer alone, bald, broke, and terrified. Instead, she reached for blame, self-pity, and the same expectation she'd always had, that I should pay the price for her decisions. The sympathy passed through me. She was human. She was still wrong. The room stayed silent. A crowd that gathers to corner one person doesn't simply disappear when the script changes. It just waits to see how the new ending unfolds. Finally, my mother asked the question they had all brought me there to answer. So, will you come take care of me? Will you move in? I need you, Cassidy. I looked at her for a long time. 2 years earlier, this same woman had listened while her daughter cried because she had cancer and decided that a wedding was more important. By then, I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply clear. I remembered the words she had once spoken to me. "We can't deal with this right now." So I handed them back to her, reduced to the only 4 words that mattered. "I can't deal either." The sentence settled over the room like stone. Nobody moved. Aunt Carol froze with her glass halfway to her lips. Vanessa's face turned white. My mother looked at me as though I had spoken a language she had never heard before. Maybe I had. The language of a boundary she never imagined I would set. "Talk to the new owner," I added, nodding toward my sister, the woman whose name was now on the deed. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I didn't need to be. The facts were doing that job on their own. Over the past 2 years, I had learned something important. The calmest person in the room is usually the one holding the truth. I stood up, slipped the folded deed back into my bag, and left behind nothing except an unfinished glass of water. I didn't slam the door. I simply walked through the house, past the relatives who had gathered to watch responsibility be placed on my shoulders, only to watch it return to the people who truly owned it. I passed the blue Pyrex dish cooling on the kitchen island. I walked out the same front door I had crossed thousands of times as a child. Halfway down the path, Aunt Carol hurried after me, breathing hard. "But she's your mother," she pleaded. "She's family." I stopped and turned toward her. "Family doesn't send you a bill for the years you survived alone," I said. Then I got into my car. The teal blanket was still waiting on the passenger seat, soft, worn, and completely mine. The one thing that had never abandoned me through the hardest season of my life. I rested my hand on it for a moment, the way people touch something solid just to remind themselves they're still standing. Then I started the engine. I drove away from the house my mother had signed away for $1. I never looked in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me I needed anymore. I had walked into that house carrying myself. I walked out still carrying myself. And for the first time in my life, leaving my family behind didn't feel like losing them. It felt like finally choosing not to lose myself. In the end, everything unfolded exactly the way logic said it would. Emotions couldn't change the numbers, and the numbers left my family with nowhere to hide. A few weeks later, after several stressful meetings with an attorney, Vanessa and Grant accepted the truth. The only practical solution was to transfer the house back into my mother's name. Their lawyer explained that reversing the property transfer would remove most of the Medicaid penalty. With one decision, the fantasy they had built around that home disappeared. The house they believed was finally theirs had never truly belonged to them in the first place. After that, they had no choice but to handle my mother's care like every other family facing reality. They hired professional caregivers, divided the expenses among themselves, and finally accepted the responsibility instead of expecting one forgotten daughter to sacrifice her entire future. I later heard that Grant barely spoke to my mother for quite some time. The house he once considered a blessing had almost become a financial disaster, and he couldn't ignore that fact anymore. Even Aunt Carol, who had always been the loudest voice about family duty, suddenly had very little to say. A few cousins reached out to me privately, admitting they had never known about the deed and apologizing for everything that had happened. Their honesty meant more to me than I expected. I never celebrated their downfall. I didn't post about it online or remind anyone they had been wrong. I simply returned to the peaceful life I had built from the ruins they left behind. Thursday evenings with Renee remained part of my routine. She had become the family I found during chemotherapy, the family I chose, not the one I was born into. My career continued growing, and I devoted myself to helping families understand complicated Medicaid situations during some of the hardest moments of their lives. I didn't completely remove my mother from my life. That's never been who I am. But I also never moved back into her house. I never became the unpaid caregiver everyone assumed I would always be. These days I still mail her a birthday card every year, but I no longer give away my peace just to earn someone's approval. That was the biggest lesson this journey taught me. Love is a choice you make freely. It should never become a debt that someone else expects you to repay with your health, your time, or your future. When people only remember your family the moment they need something from you, believe what their actions are telling you. Don't spend years hoping they'll suddenly become different. So that's where my story ends. A home signed away for $1. A blanket that carried me through the darkest chapter of my life. and 4 simple words that took me 2 long years to finally say. If this story reminded you that being needed isn't the same as being loved, let it encourage you to protect your own peace. Share it with someone who may need the reminder. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe for more real-life stories, and I'll see you in the next one.